Chapter 40 of Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 40. Shadows avaunt! Richard's himself again. Richard III. When the Black Knight, for it becomes necessary to resume the train of his adventures, left the trysting-tree of the generous outlaw, he held his way straight to a neighbouring religious house, of small extent and revenue, called the Priory of Saint Botolph, to which the wounded Ivanhoe had been removed when the castle was taken, under the guidance of the faithful Gurth and the magnanimous Wamba. It is unnecessary at present to mention what took place in the interim betwixt Wilfred and his deliverer. Suffice it to say, that after long and grave communication, messengers were dispatched by the Prior in several directions, and that on the succeeding morning the Black Knight was about to set forth on his journey, accompanied by the jester Wamba, who attended as his guide. "We will meet," he said to Ivanhoe, "at Koningsberg, the castle of the deceased Athelstane, since there thy father Cedric holds the funeral feast for his noble relation. I would see your Saxon kindred together, Sir Wilfred, and become better acquainted with them than heretofore. Thou also wilt meet me, and it shall be my task to reconcile thee to thy father." So saying, he took an affectionate farewell of Ivanhoe, who expressed an anxious desire to attend upon his deliverer. But the Black Knight would not listen to the proposal. "Rest this day; thou wilt have scarce strength enough to travel on the next. I will have no guide with me but honest Wamba, who can play priest or fool as I shall be most in the humour." "And I," said Wamba, "will attend you with all my heart. I would fain see the feasting at the funeral of Athelstane, for, if it be not full and frequent, he will rise from the dead to rebuke cook, sewer, and cupbearer, and that were a sight worth seeing. Always, Sir Knight, I will trust your valour with making my excuse to my master Cedric, in case mine own wit should fail." "And how should my poor valour succeed, Sir Jester, when thy light wit halts? Resolve me that." "Wit, Sir Knight," replied the Jester, "may do much. He is a quick apprehensive knave, who sees his neighbour's blind side, and knows how to keep the lee gage when his passions are blowing high. But valour is a sturdy fellow, that makes all split. He rows against both wind and tide, and makes way notwithstanding; and, therefore, good Sir Knight, while I take advantage of the fair weather in our noble master's temper, I will expect you to bestir yourself when it grows rough." "Sir Knight of the Fetterlock, since it is your pleasure to be so distinguished," said Ivanhoe, "I fear me you have chosen a talkative and a troublesome fool to be your guide. But he knows every path and alley in the woods as well as e'er a hunter who frequents them; and the poor knave, as thou hast partly seen, is as faithful as steel." "Nay," said the knight, "an he have the gift of showing my road, I shall not grumble with him that he desires to make it pleasant. Fare thee well, kind Wilfred. I charge thee not to attempt to travel until tomorrow at earliest." So saying, he extended his hand to Ivanhoe, who pressed it to his lips, took leave of the Prior, mounted his horse, and departed, with Wamba for his companion. Ivanhoe followed them with his eyes, until they were lost in the shades of the surrounding forest, and then returned into the convent. But shortly after matin song, he requested to see the Prior. The old man came in haste, and inquired anxiously after the state of his health. "It is better," he said, "than my fondest hope could have anticipated. Either my wound has been slighter than the effusion of blood led me to suppose, or this balsam hath wrought a wonderful cure upon it. I feel already as if I could bear my corslet; and so much the better, for thoughts pass in my mind which render me unwilling to remain here longer in inactivity." "Now, the saints forbid," said the Prior, "that the son of the Saxon Cedric should leave our convent ere his wounds were healed. It were shame to our profession were we to suffer it." "Nor would I desire to leave your hospitable roof, venerable father," said Ivanhoe, "did I not feel myself able to endure the journey, and compelled to undertake it." "And what can have urged you to so sudden a departure?" said the Prior. "Have you never, holy father," answered the knight, felt an apprehension of approaching evil, for which you in vain attempted to assign a cause? Have you never found your mind darkened, like the sunny landscape by a sudden cloud, which augurs a coming tempest? And thinkest thou not that such impulses are deserving of attention, as being the hints of our guardian spirits that danger is impending?" "I may not deny," said the Prior, crossing himself, "that such things have been, and have been of heaven; but then such communications have had a visibly useful scope and tendency. But thou, wounded as thou art, what avails it thou shouldst follow the steps of him whom thou couldst not aid, were he to be assaulted?" "Prior," said Ivanhoe, "thou dost mistake. I am stout enough to exchange buffets with any who will challenge me to such a traffic. But were it otherwise, may I not aid him were he in danger by other means than by force of arms? It is but too well known that the Saxons love not the Norman race, and who knows what may be the issue if he break in upon them when their hearts are irritated by the death of Athelstane, and their heads heated by the carousal in which they will indulge themselves? I hold his entrance among them at such a moment most perilous, and I am resolved to share or avert the danger; which, that I may the better do, I would crave of thee the use of some palfrey, whose pace may be softer than that of my destroyer." "Surely," said the worthy churchman, "you shall have mine own ambling jennet, and I would it ambled as easily for your sake, as that of the Abbot of St. Albans. Yet this will I say for Malkin, for so I call her, that unless you were to borrow a ride in the juggler's steed that paces a hornpipe amongst the eggs, you could not go on a journey on a creature so gentle and smooth-paced. I have composed many a homily on her back, to the edification of my brethren of the convent, and many poor Christian souls." "I pray you, reverend father," said Ivanhoe, "let Malkin be got ready instantly, and bid Gurth attend me with mine arms." "Nay, but fair sir," said the Prior, "I pray you to remember that Malkin hath as little skill in arms as her master, and that I warrant not her enduring the sight or weight of your full panoply. O Malkin, I promise you, is a beast of judgment, and will contend against any undue weight. I did but borrow the Fructus Temporum from the priest of St. Bees, and I promise you she would not stir from the gate until I had exchanged the huge volume for my little breviary." "Trust me, holy father," said Ivanhoe, "I will not distress her with too much weight; and if she calls a combat with me, it is odds but she has the worst." This reply was made while Gurth was buckling on the knight's heels a pair of large gilded spurs, capable of convincing any restive horse that his best safety lay in being conformable to the will of his rider. The deep and sharp rowels with which Ivanhoe's heels were now armed began to make the worthy Prior repent of his courtesy, and ejaculate, "Nay, but fair sir, now I bethink me, my Malkin abideth not the spur. Better it were that you tarry for the mare of our Manciple down at the grange, which may be had in little more than an hour, and cannot but be tractable, in respect that she draweth much of our winter firewood and eateth no corn." "I thank you, reverend father, but will abide by your first offer, as I see Malkin is already led forth to the gate. Gurth shall carry mine armour, and for the rest, rely on it, that as I will not overload Malkin's back, she shall not overcome my patience. And now, farewell." Ivanhoe now descended the stairs more hastily and easily than his wound promised, and threw himself upon the jennet, eager to escape the importunity of the Prior, who stuck as closely to his side as his age and fatness would permit, now singing the praises of Malkin, now recommending caution to the knight in managing her. "She is at the most dangerous period for maidens as well as mares," said the old man, laughing at his own jest, "being barely in her 15th year." Ivanhoe, who had other web to weave than to stand canvassing a palfrey's paces with its owner, lent but a deaf ear to the Prior's grave advices and facetious jests, and having leapt on his mare, and commanded his squire, for such Gurth now called himself, to keep close by his side, he followed the track of the Black Knight into the forest, while the Prior stood at the gate of the convent looking after him, and ejaculating, "Saint Mary! how prompt and fiery be these men of war! I would I had not trusted Malkin to his keeping, for, crippled as I am with the cold rheum, I am undone if aught but good befalls her. And yet," said he, recollecting himself, "as I would not spare my own old and disabled limbs in the good cause of Old England, so Malkin must e'en run her hazard on the same venture; and it may be they will think our poor house worthy of some munificent guerdon; or it may be they will send the old Prior a pacing nag; and if they do none of these, as great men will forget little men's service, truly I shall hold me well repaid in having done that which is right. And it is now well nigh the fitting time to summon the brethren to breakfast in the refectory. Ah! I doubt they obey that call more cheerily than the bells for primes and matins." So the Prior of Saint Botolph's hobbled back again into the refectory, to preside over the stockfish and ale, which was just serving out for the friar's breakfast. Busy and important, he sat him down at the table, and many a dark word he threw out, of benefits to be expected to the convent, and high deeds of service done by himself, which, at another season, would have attracted observation. But as the stockfish was highly salted, and the ale reasonably powerful, the jaws of the brethren were too anxiously employed to admit of their making much use of their ears. Nor do we read of any of the fraternity, who was tempted to speculate upon the mysterious hints of their Superior, except Father Diggory, who was severely afflicted by the toothache, so that he could only eat on one side of his jaws. In the meantime, the Black Champion and his guide were pacing at their leisure through the recesses of the forest. The good knight, whiles humming to himself the lay of some enamoured troubadour, sometimes encouraging by questions the prating disposition of his attendant, so that their dialogue formed a whimsical mixture of song and jest, of which we would fain give our readers some idea. You are then to imagine this knight, such as we have already described him, strong of person, tall, broad-shouldered, and large of bone, mounted on his mighty black charger, which seemed made on purpose to bear his weight, so easily he paced forward under it, having the visor of his helmet raised, in order to admit freedom of breath, yet keeping the beaver or under part closed, so that his features could be but imperfectly distinguished. But his ruddy embrowned cheekbones could be plainly seen, and the large and bright blue eyes, that flashed from under the dark shade of the raised visor; and the whole gesture and look of the champion expressed careless gaiety and fearless confidence; a mind which was unapt to apprehend danger, and prompt to defy it when most imminent, yet with whom danger was a familiar thought, as with one whose trade was war and adventure. The Jester wore his usual fantastic habit, but late accidents had led him to adopt a good cutting falchion, instead of his wooden sword, with a targe to match it. Of both which weapons he had, notwithstanding his profession, shown himself a skilful master during the storming of Torquilstone. Indeed, the infirmity of Wamba's brain consisted chiefly in a kind of impatient irritability, which suffered him not long to remain quiet in any posture, or adhere to any certain train of ideas, although he was for a few minutes alert enough in performing any immediate task, or in apprehending any immediate topic. On horseback, therefore, he was perpetually swinging himself backwards and forwards, now on the horse's ears, then anon on the very rump of the animal, now hanging both his legs on one side, and now sitting with his face to the tail, moping, mowing, and making 1,000 apish gestures, until his palfrey took his freaks so much to heart, as fairly to lay him at his length on the green grass, an incident which greatly amused the knight, but compelled his companion to ride more steadily thereafter. At the point of their journey at which we take them up, this joyous pair were engaged in singing a virelai, as it was called, in which the clown bore a mellow burden, to the better instructed knight of the Fetterlock. And thus ran the ditty: Anna Marie, love, up is the sun; Anna Marie, love, morn is begun; Mists are dispersing, love, birds singing free; Up in the morning, love, Anna Marie. Anna Marie, love, up in the morn; The hunter is winding blithe sounds on his horn; The echo rings merry from rock and from tree; 'Tis time to arouse thee, love, Anna Marie. Wamba. O Tybalt, love, Tybalt, awake me not yet, Around my soft pillow while softer dreams flit; For what are the joys that in waking we prove, Compared with those visions, O Tybalt, my love? Let the birds to the rise of the mist carol shrill, Let the hunter blow out his loud horn on the hill, Softer sounds, softer pleasures, in slumber I prove, but think not I dreamt of thee, Tybalt my love." "A dainty song," said Wamba, when they had finished their carol, "and I swear by my bauble, a pretty moral! I used to sing it with Gurth, once my playfellow, and now, by the grace of God and his master, no less than a freeman; and we once came by the cudgel for being so entranced by the melody, that we lay in bed 2 hours after sunrise, singing the ditty betwixt sleeping and waking. My bones ache at thinking of the tune ever since. Nevertheless, I have played the part of Anna Marie, to please you, fair sir." The Jester next struck into another carol, a sort of comic ditty, to which the Knight, catching up the tune, replied in the like manner. KNIGHT and WAMBA. There came 3 merry men from south, west, and north, Evermore sing the roundelay, To win the widow of Wickham forth, And where was the widow might say them nay. The first was a knight, and from Tynedale he came, Evermore sing the roundelay, And his fathers, God save us, were men of great fame, And where was the widow might say him nay. Of his father the laird, of his uncle the squire, He boasted in rhyme and in roundelay. She bade him go bask by his sea coal fire, For she was the widow would say him nay. WAMBA. The next that came forth swore by blood and by nails, Merrily sing the roundelay. Hers a gentleman, God wot, and hers lineage was of Wales, And where was the widow might say him nay. Sir David ap Morgan ap Griffith ap Hugh, Ap Tudor ap Rhys, quoth his roundelay. She said that one widow for so many was so few, And she bade the Welshman wend his way. But then next came a yeoman of Kent, Jollily singing his roundelay. He spoke to the widow of living and rent, And where was the widow could say him nay. Both. So the knight and the squire were both left in the mire, There for to sing their roundelay. For a yeoman of Kent, with his yearly rent, There never was a widow could say him nay. "I would, Wamba," said the knight, "that our host of the Trysting tree, or the jolly friar, his chaplain, heard this thy ditty in praise of our bluff yeoman." "So would not I," said Wamba, "but for the horn that hangs at your baldric." "Ay," said the knight, "this is a pledge of Locksley's good will, though I am not like to need it. 3 mots on this bugle will, I am assured, bring round, at our need, a jolly band of yonder honest yeomen." "I would say, Heaven forfend," said the Jester, "were it not that that fair gift is a pledge they would let us pass peaceably." "Why, what meanest thou?" said the knight. "Thinkest thou that but for this pledge of fellowship they would assault us?" "Nay, for me I say nothing," said Wamba, "for green trees have ears as well as stone walls. But canst thou construe me this, Sir Knight, when is thy wine pitcher and thy purse better empty than full?" "Why, never, I think," replied the knight. "Thou never deservest to have a full one in thy hand for so simple an answer. Thou hadst best empty thy pitcher ere thou pass it to a Saxon, and leave thy money at home ere thou walk in the greenwood." "You hold our friends for robbers, then?" said the Knight of the Fetterlock. "You hear me not say so, fair sir," said Wamba. "It may relieve a man's steed to take off his mail when he hath a long journey to make, and certes it may do good to the rider's soul to ease him of that which is the root of evil. Therefore will I give no hard names to those who do such services. Only I would wish my mail at home, and my purse in my chamber, when I meet with these good fellows, because it might save them some trouble." "We are bound to pray for them, my friend, notwithstanding the fair character thou dost afford them." "Pray for them with all my heart," said Wamba, "but in the town, not in the greenwood, like the Abbot of St. Bees, whom they caused to say mass with an old hollow oak tree for his stall." "Say as thou list, Wamba," replied the knight. "These yeomen did thy master Cedric yeomanly service at Torquilstone." "Ay, truly," answered Wamba, "but that was in the fashion of their trade with heaven." "Their trade, Wamba! How mean you by that?" replied his companion. "Marry, thus," said the Jester. "They make up a balanced account with heaven, as our old cellarer used to call his ciphering, as fair as Isaac the Jew keeps with his debtors, and, like him, give out a very little, and take large credit for doing so. reckoning doubtless on their own behalf the sevenfold usury which the blessed text hath promised to charitable loans. "Give me an example of your meaning, Wamba. I know nothing of ciphers or rates of usage," answered the knight. "Why," said Wamba, "an your valour be so dull, you will please to learn that those honest fellows balance a good deed with one not quite so laudable; as a crown given to a begging friar with 100 byzants taken from a fat abbot, or a wench kissed in the greenwood with the relief of a poor widow." "Which of these was the good deed, and which was the felony?" interrupted the knight. "A good jibe, said Wamba. Keeping witty company sharpeneth the apprehension. You said nothing so well, Sir Knight, I will be sworn, when you held drunken vespers with the bluff hermit. But go on. The merry men of the forest set off the building of a cottage with the burning of a castle; the thatching of a choir against the robbing of a church; the setting free of a poor prisoner against the murder of a proud sheriff; or, to come nearer to our point, the deliverance of a Saxon franklin against the burning alive of a Norman baron. Gentle thieves they are, in short, and courteous robbers; but it is ever the luckiest to meet with them when they are at the worst." "How so, Wamba?" said the knight. "Why, then they have some compunction, and are for making up matters with Heaven; but when they have struck an even balance, Heaven help them with whom they next open the account! The travellers who first met them after their good service at Torquilstone would have a woeful flaying. And yet," said Wamba, coming close up to the knight's side, "there be companions who are far more dangerous for travellers to meet than yonder outlaws." "And who may they be, for you have neither bears nor wolves, I trow?" said the knight. "Marry, sir, but we have Malvoisin's men-at-arms," said Wamba; "and let me tell you, that, in time of civil war, a half-score of these is worth a band of wolves at any time. They are now expecting their harvest, and are reinforced with the soldiers that escaped from Torquilstone; so that, should we meet with a band of them, we are like to pay for our feats of arms. Now, I pray you, Sir Knight, what would you do if we met 2 of them?" "Pin the villains to the earth with my lance, Wamba, if they offered us any impediment." "But what if there were 4 of them?" "They should drink of the same cup," answered the knight. "What if 6?" continued Wamba, "and we as we now are, barely 2? Would you not remember Locksley's horn?" "What! sound for aid!" exclaimed the knight, "against a score of such rascaille as these, whom one good knight could drive before him, as the wind drives the withered leaves?" "Nay, then," said Wamba, "I will pray you for a close sight of that same horn that hath so powerful a breath." The knight undid the clasp of the baldric, and indulged his fellow traveller, who immediately hung the bugle around his own neck. "Tra lira la," said he, whistling the notes. "Nay, I know my gamut as well as another." "How mean you, knave?" said the knight. "Restore me the bugle." "Content you, Sir Knight, it is in safe keeping. When valour and folly travel, folly should bear the horn, because she can blow the best." "Nay, but, rogue," said the Black Knight, "this exceedeth thy license. Beware ye temper not with my patience." "Urge me not with violence, Sir Knight," said the Jester, keeping at a distance from the impatient champion, "or folly will show a clean pair of heels, and leave valour to find out his way through the wood as best he may." "Nay, thou hast hit me there," said the knight, "and, sooth to say, I have little time to jangle with thee. Keep the horn an thou wilt, but let us proceed on our journey." "You will not harm me, then?" said Wamba. "I tell thee no, thou knave." "Ay, but pledge me your knightly word for it," continued Wamba, as he approached with great caution. "My knightly word I pledge, only come on with thy foolish self." "Nay, then, valour and folly are once more boon companions," said the Jester, coming up frankly to the knight's side. "But, in truth, I love not such buffets as that you bestowed on the burly friar, when his holiness rolled on the green like a king of the ninepins. And now that folly wears the horn, let valour rouse himself, and shake his mane; for, if I mistake not, there are company in yonder brake that are on the lookout for us." "What makes thee judge so?" said the knight. "Because I have twice or thrice noticed the glance of a motion from amongst the green leaves. Had they been honest men, they had kept the path. But yonder thicket is a choice chapel for the clerks of St. Nicholas." "By my faith," said the knight, closing his visor, "I think thou beest in the right on't." And in good time did he close it, for 3 arrows flew at the same instant from the suspected spot against his head and breast, one of which would have penetrated to the brain, had it not been turned aside by the steel visor. The other 2 were averted by the gorget, and by the shield which hung around his neck. "Thanks, trusty armourers," said the knight. "Wamba, let us close with them." And he rode straight to the thicket. He was met by 6 or 7 men-at-arms, who ran against him with their lances at full career. 3 of the weapons struck against him, and splintered with as little effect as if they had been driven against a tower of steel. The Black Knight's eyes seemed to flash fire even through the aperture of his visor. He raised himself in his stirrups with an air of inexpressible dignity, and exclaimed, "What means this, my masters?" The men made no other reply than by drawing their swords and attacking him on every side, crying, "Die, tyrant!" "Ha, Saint Edward! Ha, Saint George!" said the Black Knight, striking down a man at every invocation. "Have we traitors here?" His opponents, desperate as they were, bore back from an arm which carried death in every blow, and it seemed as if the terror of his single strength was about to gain the battle against such odds, when a knight in blue armour, who had hitherto kept himself behind the other assailants, spurred forward with his lance, and taking aim, not at the rider, but at the steed, wounded the noble animal mortally. "That was a felon stroke!" exclaimed the Black Knight, as the steed fell to the earth, bearing his rider along with him. And, at this moment, Wamba winded the bugle, for the whole had passed so speedily, that he had not time to do so sooner. The sudden sound made the murderers bear back once more, and Wamba, though so imperfectly weaponed, did not hesitate to rush in and assist the Black Knight to rise. "Shame on ye, false cowards!" exclaimed he in the blue harness, who seemed to lead the assailants. "Do ye fly from the empty blast of a horn blown by a jester?" Animated by his words, they attacked the Black Knight anew, whose best refuge was now to place his back against an oak, and defend himself with his sword. The felon knight, who had taken another spear, watching the moment when his formidable antagonist was most closely pressed, galloped against him in hopes to nail him with his lance against the tree, when his purpose was again intercepted by Wamba. The jester, making up by agility the want of strength, and little noticed by the men-at-arms, who were busied in their more important object, hovered on the skirts of the fight, and effectually checked the fatal career of the Blue Knight by hamstringing his horse with a stroke of his sword. Horse and man went to the ground, yet the situation of the Knight of the Fetterlock continued very precarious, as he was pressed close by several men completely armed, and began to be fatigued by the violent exertions necessary to defend himself on so many points at nearly the same moment, when a grey goose shaft suddenly stretched on the earth one of the most formidable of his assailants, and a band of yeomen broke forth from the glade, headed by Locksley and the jovial Friar, who, taking ready and effectual part in the fray, soon disposed of the ruffians, all of whom lay on the spot dead or mortally wounded. The Black Knight thanked his deliverers with a dignity they had not observed in his former bearing, which hitherto had seemed rather that of a blunt bold soldier than of a person of exalted rank. "It concerns me much," he said, "even before I express my full gratitude to my ready friends, to discover, if I may, who have been my unprovoked enemies. Open the visor of that Blue Knight, Wamba, who seems to be the chief of these villains." The jester instantly made up to the leader of the assassins, who, bruised by his fall, and entangled under the wounded steed, lay incapable either of flight or resistance. "Come, valiant sir," said Wamba, "I must be your armourer as well as your equerry. I have dismounted you, and now I will unhelm you." So saying, with no very gentle hand he undid the helmet of the Blue Knight, which, rolling to a distance on the grass, displayed to the Knight of the Fetterlock grizzled locks, and a countenance he did not expect to have seen under such circumstances. "Waldemar Fitzurse!" he said in astonishment, "what could urge one of thy rank and seeming worth to so foul an undertaking?" "Richard," said the captive knight, looking up to him, thou knowest little of mankind, if thou knowest not to what ambition and revenge can lead every child of Adam." "Revenge?" answered the Black Knight. "I never wronged thee. On me thou hast naught to revenge." "My daughter, Richard, whose alliance thou didst scorn, was that no injury to a Norman whose blood is as noble as thine own?" "Thy daughter?" replied the Black Knight. "A proper cause of enmity, and followed up to a bloody issue! Stand back, my masters, I would speak to him alone. And now, Waldemar Fitzurse, say me the truth. Confess who set thee on this traitorous deed." "Thy father's son," answered Waldemar, "who, in so doing, did but avenge on thee thy disobedience to thy father." Richard's eyes sparkled with indignation, but his better nature overcame it. He pressed his hand against his brow, and remained an instant gazing on the face of the humbled Baron, in whose features pride was contending with shame. "Thou dost not ask thy life, Waldemar," said the King. "He that is in the lion's clutch," answered Fitzurse, "knows it were needless." "Take it then unasked," said Richard. "The lion preys not on prostrate carcasses. Take thy life, but with this condition, that in 3 days thou shalt leave England, and go to hide thine infamy in thy Norman castle, and that thou wilt never mention the name of John of Anjou as connected with thy felony. If thou art found on English ground after the space I have allotted thee, thou diest, or if thou breathest aught that can attaint the honour of my house, by Saint George, not the altar itself shall be a sanctuary. I will hang thee out to feed the ravens, from the very pinnacle of thine own castle. Let this knight have a steed, Locksley, for I see your yeomen have caught those which were running loose, and let him depart unharmed." "But that I judge I listen to a voice whose behests must not be disputed," answered the yeoman, "I would send a shaft after the skulking villain that should spare him the labour of a long journey." "Thou bearest an English heart, Locksley," said the Black Knight, "and well dost judge thou art the more bound to obey my behest. I am Richard of England." At these words, pronounced in a tone of majesty suited to the high rank, and no less distinguished character of Cœur de Lion, the yeomen at once kneeled down before him, and at the same time tendered their allegiance, and implored pardon for their offences. "Rise, my friends," said Richard, in a gracious tone, looking on them with a countenance in which his habitual good humour had already conquered the blaze of hasty resentment, and whose features retained no mark of the late desperate conflict, excepting the flush arising from exertion. "Arise," he said, "my friends. Your misdemeanours, whether in forest or field, have been atoned by the loyal services you rendered my distressed subjects before the walls of Torquilstone, and the rescue you have this day afforded to your sovereign. Arise, my liege men, and be good subjects in future. And thou, brave Locksley—" "Call me no longer Locksley, my liege, but know me under the name, which, I fear, fame hath blown too widely not to have reached even your royal ears. I am Robin Hood of Sherwood Forest." "King of outlaws and prince of good fellows!" said the King, "who hath not heard a name that has been borne as far as Palestine? But be assured, brave outlaw, that no deed done in our absence, and in the turbulent times to which it hath given rise, shall be remembered to thy disadvantage." "True says the proverb," said Wamba, interposing his word, but with some abatement of his usual petulance, "when the cat is away, the mice will play." "What, Wamba, art thou there?" said Richard. "I have been so long of hearing thy voice, I thought thou hadst taken flight." "I take flight!" said Wamba. "When do you ever find folly separated from valour? There lies the trophy of my sword, that good grey gelding, whom I heartily wish upon his legs again, conditioning his master lay there hewed in his place. It is true, I gave a little ground at first, for a motley jacket does not brook lance heads, as a steel doublet will; but if I fought not at sword's point, you will grant me that I sounded the onset." "And to good purpose, honest Wamba," replied the King. "Thy good service shall not be forgotten." "Confiteor! Confiteor!" exclaimed, in a submissive tone, a voice near the King's side. "My Latin will carry me no farther; but I confess my deadly treason, and pray leave to have absolution before I am led to execution." Richard looked around, and beheld the jovial friar on his knees, telling his rosary, while his quarter-staff, which had not been idle during the skirmish, lay on the grass beside him. His countenance was gathered so as he thought might best express the most profound contrition, his eyes being turned up, and the corners of his mouth drawn down, as Wamba expressed it, like the tassels at the mouth of a purse. Yet this demure affectation of extreme penitence was whimsically belied by a ludicrous meaning which lurked in his huge features, and seemed to pronounce his fear and repentance alike hypocritical. "For what art thou cast down, mad priest?" said Richard. "Art thou afraid thy diocesan should learn how truly thou dost serve Our Lady and Saint Dunstan? Tush, man, fear it not. Richard of England betrays no secrets that pass over the flagon." "Nay, most gracious sovereign," answered the hermit, well known to the curious in penny histories of Robin Hood by the name of Friar Tuck, "it is not the crosier I fear, but the scepter. Alas, that my sacrilegious fist should ever have been applied to the ear of the Lord's anointed!" "Ha, ha!" said Richard, "sits the wind there? In truth I had forgotten the buffet, though mine ear sung after it for a whole day. But if the cuff was fairly given, I will be judged by the good men around, if it was not as well repaid; or if thou thinkest I still owe thee aught, and will stand forth for another counterbuff." "By no means," replied Friar Tuck. "I had mine own returned, and with usury. May your majesty ever pay your debts as fully." "If I could do so with cuffs," said the king, "my creditors should have little reason to complain of an empty exchequer." "And yet," said the friar, resuming his demure hypocritical countenance, "I know not what penance I ought to perform for that most sacrilegious blow." "Speak no more of it, brother," said the king. "After having stood so many cuffs from Paynims and misbelievers, I were void of reason to quarrel with the buffet of a clerk so holy as he of Copmanhurst. Yet, mine honest friar, I think it would be best both for the church and thyself, that I should procure a license to unfrock thee, and retain thee as a yeoman of our guard, serving in care of our person, as formerly in attendance upon the altar of Saint Dunstan." "My liege," said the friar, "I humbly crave your pardon, and you would readily grant my excuse, did you but know how the sin of laziness has beset me. Saint Dunstan, may he be gracious to us, stands quiet in his niche, though I should forget my orisons in killing a fat buck. I stay out of my cell sometimes at night, doing I wot not what. Saint Dunstan never complains; a quiet master he is, and a peaceful, as ever was made of wood. But to be a yeoman in attendance on my sovereign the king, the honour is great, doubtless; yet, if I were but to step aside to comfort a widow in one corner, or to kill a deer in another, it would be, 'Where is the dog priest?' says one. 'Who has seen the accursed Tuck?' says another. 'The unfrocked villain destroys more venison than half the country besides,' says one keeper. 'And is hunting after every shy doe in the country,' quoth the second. In fine, good my liege, I pray you to leave me as you found me; or, if in aught you desire to extend your benevolence to me, that I may be considered as the poor clerk of Saint Dunstan's cell in Copmanhurst, to whom any small donation will be most thankfully acceptable." "I understand thee," said the king, "and the holy clerk shall have a grant of vert and venison in my woods of Warncliffe. Mark, however, I will but assign thee 3 bucks every season; but if that do not prove an apology for thy slaying 30, I am no Christian knight nor true king." "Your grace may be well assured," said the friar, "that, with the grace of Saint Dunstan, I shall find the way of multiplying your most bounteous gift." "I nothing doubt it, good brother," said the king; "and as venison is but dry food, our cellarer shall have orders to deliver to thee a butt of sack, a runlet of malvoisie, and 3 hogsheads of ale for the first strike, yearly. If that will not quench thy thirst, thou must come to court, and become acquainted with my butler." "But for Saint Dunstan?" said the friar. "A cope, a stole, and an altar cloth shalt thou also have," continued the king, crossing himself; "but we may not turn our game into earnest, lest God punish us for thinking more on our follies than on his honour and worship." "I will answer for my patron," said the priest joyously. "Answer for thyself, friar," said King Richard, something sternly. but immediately stretching out his hand to the hermit, the latter, somewhat abashed, bent his knee and saluted it. "Thou dost less honour to my extended palm than to my clenched fist," said the monarch. "Thou didst only kneel to the one, and to the other didst prostrate thyself." But the friar, afraid perhaps of again giving offence by continuing the conversation in too jocose a style, a false step to be particularly guarded against by those who converse with monarchs, bowed profoundly and fell into the rear. At the same time two additional personages appeared on the scene. Chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 41. All hail to the lordlings of high degree, Who live not more happy, though greater than we. Our pastimes to see, under every green tree, In all the gay woodland right welcome ye be. MacDonald. The newcomers were Wilfred of Ivanhoe, on the Prior of Botolph's palfrey, and Gurth, who attended him, on the knight's own war-horse. The astonishment of Ivanhoe was beyond bounds, when he saw his master besprinkled with blood, and 6 or 7 dead bodies lying around in the little glade in which the battle had taken place. Nor was he less surprised to see Richard surrounded by so many Sylvan attendants, the outlaws, as they seemed to be, of the forest, and a perilous retinue therefore for a prince. He hesitated whether to address the king as the Black Knight errant, or in what other manner to demean himself towards him. Richard saw his embarrassment. "Fear not, Wilfred," he said, "to address Richard Plantagenet as himself, since thou seest him in the company of true English hearts, although it may be they have been urged a few steps aside by warm English blood." "Sir Wilfred of Ivanhoe," said the gallant outlaw, stepping forward, "my assurances can add nothing to those of our sovereign; yet let me say, somewhat proudly, that of men who have suffered much, he hath not truer subjects than those who now stand around him." "I cannot doubt it, brave man," said Wilfred, "since thou art of the number. But what mean these marks of death and danger? These slain men, and the bloody armour of my prince?" "Treason hath been with us, Ivanhoe," said the king; "but thanks to these brave men, treason hath met its meed. But now, I bethink thee, thou too art a traitor," said Richard, smiling; "a most disobedient traitor, for were not our orders positive, that thou shouldst repose thyself at Saint Botolph's until thy wound was healed?" "It is healed," said Ivanhoe; "it is not of more consequence than the scratch of a bodkin. But why, oh why, noble prince, will you thus vex the hearts of your faithful servants, and expose your life by lonely journeys and rash adventures, as if it were of no more value than that of a mere knight-errant, who has no interest on earth but what lance and sword may procure him?" "And Richard Plantagenet," said the king, "desires no more fame than his good lance and sword may acquire him; and Richard Plantagenet is prouder of achieving an adventure, with only his good sword, and his good arm to speed, than if he led to battle a host of 100,000 armed men." "But your kingdom, my liege," said Ivanhoe, "your kingdom is threatened with dissolution and civil war; your subjects menaced with every species of evil, if deprived of their sovereign in some of those dangers which it is your daily pleasure to incur, and from which you have but this moment narrowly escaped." "Ho, ho! my kingdom and my subjects?" answered Richard impatiently. "I tell thee, Sir Wilfred, the best of them are most willing to repay my follies in kind. For example, my very faithful servant, Wilfred of Ivanhoe, will not obey my positive commands, and yet reads his king a homily, because he does not walk exactly by his advice. Which of us has most reason to upbraid the other? Yet forgive me, my faithful Wilfred. The time I have spent, and am yet to spend in concealment, is, as I explained to thee at Saint Botolph's, necessary to give my friends and faithful nobles time to assemble their forces, that when Richard's return is announced, he should be at the head of such a force as enemies shall tremble to face, and thus subdue the meditated treason, without even unsheathing a sword. Estoteville and Bohun will not be strong enough to move forward to York for 24 hours. I must have news of Salisbury from the south, and of Beauchamp in Warwickshire, and of Moulton and Percy in the north. The Chancellor must make sure of London. Too sudden an appearance would subject me to dangers, other than my lance and sword, though backed by the bow of bold Robin, or the quarter-staff of Friar Tuck, and the horn of the sage Wamba, may be able to rescue me from." Wilfred bowed in submission, well knowing how vain it was to contend with the wild spirit of chivalry which so often impelled his master upon dangers which he might easily have avoided, or rather, which it was unpardonable in him to have sought out. The young knight sighed, therefore, and held his peace; while Richard, rejoiced at having silenced his counsellor, though his heart acknowledged the justice of the charge he had brought against him, went on in conversation with Robin Hood. "King of outlaws," he said, "have you no refreshment to offer to your brother's sovereign? For these dead knaves have found me both in exercise and appetite." "In troth," replied the Outlaw, "for I scorn to lie to your Grace, our larder is chiefly supplied with—" He stopped, and was somewhat embarrassed. "With venison, I suppose?" said Richard gaily. "Better food at need there can be none, and truly, if a king will not remain at home and slay his own game, methinks he should not brawl too loud if he finds it killed to his hand." "If your Grace, then," said Robin, "will again honour with your presence one of Robin Hood's places of rendezvous, the venison shall not be lacking, and a stoup of ale, and it may be a cup of reasonably good wine, to relish it withal." The Outlaw accordingly led the way, followed by the buxom Monarch, more happy, probably, in this chance meeting with Robin Hood and his foresters, than he would have been in again assuming his royal state and presiding over a splendid circle of peers and nobles. Novelty in society and adventure were the zest of life to Richard Cœur-de-Lion, and it had its highest relish when enhanced by dangers encountered and surmounted. In the lion-hearted king, the brilliant but useless character of a knight of romance was in a great measure realized and revived; and the personal glory which he acquired by his own deeds of arms was far more dear to his excited imagination than that which a course of policy and wisdom would have spread around his government. Accordingly, his reign was like the course of a brilliant and rapid meteor, which shoots along the face of heaven, shedding around an unnecessary and portentous light, which is instantly swallowed up by universal darkness; his feats of chivalry furnishing themes for bards and minstrels, but affording none of those solid benefits to his country on which history loves to pause, and hold up as an example to posterity. But in his present company Richard showed to the greatest imaginable advantage. He was gay, good-humoured, and fond of manhood in every rank of life. Beneath a huge oak tree the sylvan repast was hastily prepared for the King of England, surrounded by men outlaws to his government, but who now formed his court and his guard. As the flagon went round, the rough foresters soon lost their awe for the presence of majesty. A song and the jest were exchanged, the stories of former deeds were told with advantage, and at length, and while boasting of their successful infraction of the laws, no one recollected they were speaking in presence of their natural guardian. The merry King, nothing heeding his dignity any more than his company, laughed, quaffed, and jested among the jolly band. The natural and rough sense of Robin Hood led him to be desirous that the scene should be closed ere anything should occur to disturb its harmony, the more especially that he observed Ivanhoe's brow clouded with anxiety. "We are honoured," he said to Ivanhoe, apart, "by the presence of our gallant sovereign; yet I would not that he dallied with time, which the circumstance of his kingdom may render precious." "It is well and wisely spoken, brave Robin Hood," said Wilfred, apart; "and know, moreover, that they who jest with majesty, even in its gayest mood, are but toying with the lion's whelp, which, on slight provocation, uses both fangs and claws." "You have touched the very cause of my fear," said the Outlaw. "My men are rough by practice and nature, the King is hasty as well as good-humoured; nor know I how soon cause of offence may arise, or how warmly it may be received. It is time this revel were broken off." "It must be by your management, then, gallant yeoman," said Ivanhoe, "for each hint I have essayed to give him serves only to induce him to prolong it." "Must I so soon risk the pardon and favour of my sovereign?" said Robin Hood, pausing for all instant. "But by Saint Christopher it shall be so. I were undeserving his grace did I not peril it for his good. Here, Scathlock, get thee behind yonder thicket, and wind me a Norman blast on thy bugle, and without an instant's delay, on peril of your life." Scathlock obeyed his captain, and in less than 5 minutes the revellers were started by the sound of his horn. "It is the bugle of Malvoisin," said the miller, starting to his feet and seizing the bow. The Friar dropped the flagon, and grasped his quarter staff. Wamba stopped short in the midst of a jest, and betook himself to sword and target. All the others stood to their weapons. Men of their precarious course of life change readily from the banquet to the battle, and, to Richard, the exchange seemed but a succession of pleasure. He called for his helmet and the most cumbrous parts of his armour, which he had laid aside; and while Gurth was putting them on, he laid his strict injunctions on Wilfred, under pain of his highest displeasure, not to engage in the skirmish which he supposed was approaching. "Thou hast fought for me 100 times, Wilfred, and I have seen it. Thou shalt this day look on, and see how Richard will fight for his friend and liegeman." In the meantime, Robin Hood had sent off several of his followers in different directions, as if to reconnoitre the enemy; and when he saw the company effectually broken up, he approached Richard, who was now completely armed, and, kneeling down on one knee, craved pardon of his sovereign. "For what, good yeoman?" said Richard, somewhat impatiently. "Have we not already granted thee a full pardon for all transgressions? Thinkest thou our word is a feather, to be blown backward and forward between us? Thou canst not have had time to commit any new offence since that time." "Ay, but I have, though," answered the yeoman, "if it be an offence to deceive my prince for his own advantage. The bugle you have heard was none of Malvoisin's, but blown by my direction, to break off the banquet, lest it trenched upon hours of dearer import than to be thus dallied with." He then rose from his knee, folded his arm on his bosom, and in a manner rather respectful than submissive, awaited the answer of the king, like one who is conscious he may have given offence, yet is confident in the rectitude of his motive. The blood rushed in anger to the countenance of Richard, but it was the first transient emotion, and his sense of justice instantly subdued it. "The King of Sherwood," he said, "grudges his venison and his wine-flask to the King of England? It is well, bold Robin; but when you come to see me in merry London, I trust to be a less niggard host. Thou art right, however, good fellow. Let us therefore to horse and away. Wilfred has been impatient this hour. Tell me, bold Robin, hast thou never a friend in thy band, who, not content with advising, will needs direct thy motions, and look miserable when thou dost presume to act for thyself?" "Such a one," said Robin, "is my lieutenant, Little John, who is even now absent on an expedition as far as the borders of Scotland; and I will own to your Majesty, that I am sometimes displeased by the freedom of his counsels; but, when I think twice, I cannot be long angry with one who can have no motive for his anxiety save zeal for his master's service." "Thou art right, good yeoman," answered Richard; "and if I had Ivanhoe, on the one hand, to give grave advice, and recommended by the sad gravity of his brow, and thee, on the other, to trick me into what thou thinkest my own good, I should have as little the freedom of mine own will as any king in Christendom or heathenesse. But come, sirs, let us merrily on to Koningsberg, and think no more on't." Robin Hood assured them that he had detached a party in the direction of the road they were to pass, who would not fail to discover and apprise them of any secret ambuscade; and that he had little doubt they would find the ways secure, or, if otherwise, would receive such timely notice of the danger as would enable them to fall back on a strong troop of archers, with which he himself proposed to follow on the same route. The wise and attentive precautions adopted for his safety touched Richard's feelings, and removed any slight grudge which he might retain on account of the deception the outlaw captain had practised upon him. He once more extended his hand to Robin Hood, assured him of his full pardon and future favour, as well as his firm resolution to restrain the tyrannical exercise of the forest rights, and other oppressive laws, by which so many English yeomen were driven into a state of rebellion. But Richard's good intentions towards the bold outlaw were frustrated by the king's untimely death, and the charter of the forest was extorted from the unwilling hands of King John when he succeeded to his heroic brother. As for the rest of Robin Hood's career, as well as the tale of his treacherous death, they are to be found in those black-letter garlands, once sold at the low and easy rate of 1/2 penny. Now cheaply purchased at their weight in gold. The outlaw's opinion proved true, and the King, attended by Ivanhoe, Gurth, and Wamba, arrived, without any interruption, within view of the castle of Koningsberg, while the sun was yet in the horizon. There are few more beautiful or striking scenes in England than are presented by the vicinity of this ancient Saxon fortress. The soft and gentle river Don sweeps through an amphitheatre, in which cultivation is richly blended with woodland, and on a mount, ascending from the river, well defended by walls and ditches, rises this ancient edifice, which, as its Saxon name implies, was, previous to the Conquest, a royal residence of the kings of England. The outer walls have probably been added by the Normans, but the inner keep bears token of a very great antiquity. It is situated on a mount at one angle of the inner court, and forms a complete circle of perhaps 25 feet in diameter. The wall is of immense thickness, and is propped or defended by 6 huge external buttresses which project from the circle, and rise up against the sides of the tower, as if to strengthen or to support it. These massive buttresses are solid when they arise from the foundation, and a good way higher up; but are hollowed out towards the top, and terminate in a sort of turrets communicating with the interior of the keep itself. The distant appearance of this huge building, with these singular accompaniments, is as interesting to the lovers of the picturesque as the interior of the castle is to the eager antiquary, whose imagination it carries back to the days of the Heptarchy. A barrow, in the vicinity of the castle, is pointed out as the tomb of the memorable Hengist, and various monuments, of great antiquity and curiosity, are shown in the neighbouring churchyard. When Cœur de Lion and his retinue approached this rude yet stately building, it was not, as at present, surrounded by external fortifications. The Saxon architect had exhausted his art in rendering the main keep defensible, and there was no other circumvallation than a rude barrier of palisades. A huge black banner, which floated from the top of the tower, announced that the obsequies of the late owner were still in the act of being solemnized. It bore no emblem of the deceased's birth or quality, for armorial bearings were then a novelty among the Norman chivalry themselves, and were totally unknown to the Saxons. But above the gate was another banner, on which the figure of a white horse, rudely painted, indicated the nation and rank of the deceased, by the well-known symbol of Hengist and his Saxon warriors. All around the castle was a scene of busy commotion; for such funeral banquets were times of general and profuse hospitality, which not only every one who could claim the most distant connection with the deceased, but all passengers whatsoever, were invited to partake. The wealth and consequence of the deceased Athelstane occasioned this custom to be observed in the fullest extent. Numerous parties, therefore, were seen ascending and descending the hill on which the castle was situated; and when the King and his attendants entered the open and unguarded gates of the external barrier, the space within presented a scene not easily reconciled with the cause of the assemblage. In one place cooks were toiling to roast huge oxen and fat sheep; in another, hogsheads of ale were set abroach, to be drained at the freedom of all comers. Groups of every description were to be seen devouring the food and swallowing the liquor thus abandoned to their discretion. The naked Saxon serf was drowning the sense of his half-year's hunger and thirst in one day of gluttony and drunkenness; the more pampered burgess and guild-brother was eating his morsel with gust, or curiously criticizing the quantity of the malt and the skill of the brewer. Some few of the poorer Norman gentry might also be seen, distinguished by their shaven chins and short cloaks, and not less so by their keeping together, and looking with great scorn on the whole solemnity, even while condescending to avail themselves of the good cheer which was so liberally supplied. Mendicants were of course assembled by the score, together with strolling soldiers returned from Palestine, according to their own account at least; pedlars were displaying their wares; travelling mechanics were inquiring after employment, and wandering palmers, hedge-priests, Saxon minstrels, and Welsh bards were muttering prayers and extracting mistuned dirges from their harps, crowds, and rotes. One sent forth the praises of Athelstane in a doleful panegyric; another, in a Saxon genealogical poem, rehearsed the uncouth and harsh names of his noble ancestry. Jesters and jugglers were not a-wanting, nor was the occasion of the assembly supposed to render the exercise of their profession indecorous or improper. Indeed, the ideas of the Saxons on these occasions were as natural as they were rude. If sorrow was thirsty, there was drink; if hungry, there was food. If it sunk down upon and saddened the heart, there were means supplied of mirth, or at least of amusement. Nor did the assistants scorn to avail themselves of those means of consolation, although, every now and then, as if suddenly recollecting the cause which had brought them together, the men groaned in unison, while the females, of whom many were present, raised up their voices and shrieked for very woe. Such was the scene in the castle yard of Koningsberg when it was entered by Richard and his followers. The seneschal or steward deigned not to take notice of the groups of inferior guests, who were perpetually entering and withdrawing, unless so far as was necessary to preserve order. Nevertheless, he was struck by the good mien of the monarch and Ivanhoe, more especially as he imagined the features of the latter were familiar to him. Besides, the approach of two knights, for such their dress bespoke them, was a rare event at a Saxon solemnity, and could not but be regarded as a sort of honour to the deceased and his family. And, in his sable dress, and holding in his hand his white wand of office, this important personage made way through the miscellaneous assemblage of guests, thus conducting Richard and Ivanhoe to the entrance of the tower. Gurth and Wamba speedily found acquaintances in the courtyard, nor presumed to intrude themselves any farther until their presence should be required. Chapter 41. Of Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 42. I found them winding of Marcello's corpse, and there was such a solemn melody, twixt doleful songs, tears, and sad elegies, such as old grandames, watching by the dead, are wont to outwear the night with. Old Play. The mode of entering the great tower of Koningsberg Castle is very peculiar, and partakes of the rude simplicity of the early times in which it was erected. A flight of steps, so deep and narrow as to be almost precipitous, leads up to a low portal in the south side of the tower, by which the adventurous antiquary may still, or at least could a few years since, gain access to a small stair within the thickness of the main wall of the tower, which leads up to the third story of the building, the two lower being dungeons or vaults, which neither receive air nor light, save by a square hole in the third story, with which they seem to have communicated by a ladder. The access to the upper apartments in the tower, which consist in all of 4 stories, is given by stairs which are carried up through the external buttresses. By this difficult and complicated entrance, the good King Richard, followed by his faithful Ivanhoe, was ushered into the round apartment which occupies the whole of the third story from the ground. Wilfred, by the difficulties of the ascent, gained time to muffle his face in his mantle, as it had been held expedient that he should not present himself to his father until the king should give him the signal. There were assembled in this apartment, around a large oaken table, about a dozen of the most distinguished representatives of the Saxon families in the adjacent counties. They were all old, or, at least, elderly men. For the younger race, to the great displeasure of the seniors, had, like Ivanhoe, broken down many of the barriers which separated for half a century the Norman victors from the vanquished Saxons. The downcast and sorrowful looks of these venerable men, their silence and their mournful posture, formed a strong contrast to the levity of the revellers on the outside of the castle. Their grey locks and long full beards, together with their antique tunics and loose black mantles, suited well with the singular and rude apartment in which they were seated, and gave the appearance of a band of ancient worshippers of Woden, recalled to life to mourn over the decay of their national glory. Cedric, seated in equal rank among his countrymen, seemed yet, by common consent, to act as chief of the assembly. Upon the entrance of Richard, only known to him as the valorous Knight of the Fetterlock, he arose gravely, and gave him welcome by the ordinary salutation, "Wyse hael," raising at the same time a goblet to his head. The King, no stranger to the customs of his English subjects, returned the greeting with the appropriate words, "Drink hael," and partook of a cup which was handed to him by the sewer. The same courtesy was offered to Ivanhoe, who pledged his father in silence, supplying the usual speech by an inclination of his head, lest his voice should have been recognized. When this introductory ceremony was performed, Cedric arose, and extending his hand to Richard, conducted him into a small and very rude chapel, which was excavated, as it were, out of one of the external buttresses. As there was no opening, saving a little narrow loophole, the place would have been nearly quite dark but for two flambeaux or torches, which showed, by a red and smoky light, the arched roof and naked walls, the rude altar of stone, and the crucifix of the same material. Before this altar was placed a bier, and on each side of the bier kneeled 3 priests, who told their beads and muttered their prayers, with the greatest signs of external devotion. For this service a splendid soul scat was paid to the convent of St. Edmund's by the mother of the deceased; and, that it might be fully deserved, the whole brethren, saving the lame sacristan, had transferred themselves to Koningsberg, where, while 6 of their number were constantly on guard in the performance of divine rites by the bier of Athelstane, the others failed not to take their share of the refreshments and amusements which went on at the castle. In maintaining this pious watch and ward, the good monks were particularly careful not to interrupt their hymns for an instant, lest Zernebock, the ancient Saxon Apollyon, should lay his clutches on the departed Athelstane. Nor were they any less careful to prevent any unhallowed layman from touching the pall, which, having been that used at the funeral of St. Edmund, was liable to be desecrated if handled by the profane. If, in truth, these attentions could be of any use to the deceased, he had some right to expect them at the hands of the brethren of St. Edmund's, since, besides 100 mancuses of gold paid down as the soul ransom, the mother of Athelstane had announced her intention of endowing that foundation with the better part of the lands of the deceased, in order to maintain perpetual prayers for his soul, and that of her departed husband. Richard and Wilfred followed the Saxon Cedric into the apartment of death, where, as their guide pointed with solemn air to the untimely bier of Athelstane, they followed his example in devoutly crossing themselves, and muttering a brief prayer for the weal of the departed soul. This act of pious charity performed, Cedric again motioned them to follow him, gliding over the stone floor with a noiseless tread, and, after ascending a few steps, opened with great caution the door of a small oratory, which adjoined to the chapel. It was about 8 feet square, hollowed, like the chapel itself, out of the thickness of the wall; and the loophole, which enlightened it, being to the west, and widening considerably as it sloped inward, a beam of the setting sun found its way into its dark recess, and showed a female of a dignified mien, and whose countenance retained the marked remains of majestic beauty. Her long mourning robes and her flowing wimple of black cypress enhanced the whiteness of her skin, and the beauty of her light-coloured and flowing tresses, which time had neither thinned nor mingled with silver. Her countenance expressed the deepest sorrow that is consistent with resignation. On the stone table before her stood a crucifix of ivory, beside which was laid a missal, having its pages richly illuminated, and its boards adorned with clasps of gold, and bosses of the same precious metal. "Noble Edith," said Cedric, after having stood a moment silent, as if to give Richard and Wilfred time to look upon the lady of the mansion, "these are worthy strangers come to take a part in thy sorrows; and this, in especial, is the valiant knight who fought so bravely for the deliverance of him for whom we this day mourn." "His bravery has my thanks," returned the lady, "although it be the will of Heaven that it should be displayed in vain. I thank, too, his courtesy, and that of his companion, which hath brought them hither to behold the widow of Adeling, the mother of Athelstane, in her deep hour of sorrow and lamentation. To your care, kind kinsman, I entrust them, satisfied that they will want no hospitality which these sad walls can yet afford." The guests bowed deeply to the mourning parent, and withdrew from their hospitable guide. Another winding stair conducted them to an apartment of the same size with that which they had first entered, occupying indeed the story immediately above. From this room, ere yet the door was opened, proceeded a low and melancholy strain of vocal music. When they entered, they found themselves in the presence of about 20 matrons and maidens of distinguished Saxon lineage. 4 maidens, Rowena leading the choir, raised a hymn for the soul of the deceased, of which we have only been able to decipher 2 or 3 stanzas. Dust into dust, to this all must, the tenant hath resigned, the fated form to waste and worm, corruption claims her kind. Through paths unknown thy soul hath flown, to seek the realms of woe, where fiery pain shall purge the stain of actions done below. In that sad place, by Mary's grace, brief may thy dwelling be, till prayers and alms and holy psalms shall set the captive free. While this dirge was sung, in a low and melancholy tone, by the female choristers, The others were divided into 2 bands, of which one was engaged in bedecking, with such embroidery as their skill and taste could compass, a large silken pall, destined to cover the bier of Athelstane, while the others busied themselves in selecting, from baskets of flowers placed before them, garlands, which they intended for the same mournful purpose. The behaviour of the maidens was decorous, if not marked with deep affliction; but now and then a whisper or a smile called forth the rebuke of the severer matrons, and here and there might be seen a damsel, more interested in endeavouring to find out how her mourning robe became her, than in the dismal ceremony for which they were preparing. Neither was this propensity, if we must needs confess the truth, at all diminished by the appearance of 2 strange knights, which occasioned some looking up, peeping, and whispering. Rowena alone, too proud to be vain, paid her greeting to her deliverer with a graceful courtesy. Her demeanour was serious, but not dejected; and it may be doubted whether thoughts of Ivanhoe, and of the uncertainty of his fate, did not claim as great a share in her gravity as the death of her kinsman. To Cedric, however, who, as we have observed, was not remarkably clear-sighted on such occasions, the sorrow of his ward seemed so much deeper than any of the other maidens, that he deemed it proper to whisper the explanation. She was the affianced bride of the noble Athelstane. It may be doubted whether this communication went a far way to increase Wilfred's disposition to sympathize with the mourners of Koningsberg. Having thus formally introduced the guests to the different chambers in which the obsequies of Athelstane were celebrated under different forms, Cedric conducted them into a small room, destined, as he informed them, for the exclusive accommodation of honourable guests, whose more slight connexion with the deceased might render them unwilling to join those who were immediately affected by the unhappy event. He assured them of every accommodation, and was about to withdraw, when the Black Knight took his hand. "I crave to remind you, noble Thane," he said, "that when we last parted, you promised, for the service I had the fortune to render you, to grant me a boon." "It is granted ere named, noble knight," said Cedric; "yet, at this sad moment—" "Of that also," said the King, "I have bethought me; but my time is brief; neither does it seem to me unfit, that, when closing the grave on the noble Athelstane, we should deposit therein certain prejudices and hasty opinions." "Sir Knight of the Fetterlock," said Cedric, colouring, and interrupting the King in his turn, "I trust your boon regards yourself and no other; for in that which concerns the honour of my house, it is scarce fitting that a stranger should mingle." "Nor do I wish to mingle," said the King mildly, "unless in so far as you will admit me to have an interest. As yet you have known me but as the Black Knight of the Fetterlock—know me now as Richard Plantagenet." "Richard of Anjou!" exclaimed Cedric, stepping backward with the utmost astonishment. "No, noble Cedric, Richard of England, whose deepest interest, whose deepest wish, is to see her sons united with each other. And, how now, worthy Thane? Hast thou no knee for thy prince?" "To Norman blood," said Cedric, "it hath never bended." "Reserve thine homage, then," said the Monarch, "until I shall prove my right to it by equal protection of Normans and English." "Prince," answered Cedric, "I have ever done justice to thy bravery and thy worth, nor am I ignorant of thy claim to the crown through thy descent from Matilda, niece to Edgar Atheling, and daughter to Malcolm of Scotland. But Matilda, though of the royal Saxon blood, was not the heir to the monarchy." "I will not dispute my title with thee, noble Thane," said Richard calmly; "but I will bid thee look around thee, and see where thou wilt find another to be put into the scale against it." "And hast thou wandered hither, Prince, to tell me so?" said Cedric; "to upbraid me with the ruin of my race, ere the grave has closed over the last scion of Saxon royalty?" His countenance darkened as he spoke. "It was boldly, it was rashly done." "Not so, by the Holy Rood!" replied the King; "it was done in the frank confidence which one brave man may repose in another, without a shadow of danger." "Thou sayest well, Sir King; for king I own thou art, and wilt be, despite of my feeble opposition. I dare not take the only mode to prevent it, though thou hast placed the strong temptation within my reach." "And now to my boon," said the King, "which I ask not with one jot the less confidence that thou hast refused to acknowledge my lawful sovereignty. I require of thee, as a man of thy word, on pain of being held faithless, mansworn, and niddering, to forgive and receive to thy paternal affection the good knight, Wilfred of Ivanhoe. In this reconciliation thou wilt own I have an interest, the happiness of my friend, and the quelling of dissension among my faithful people." "And this is Wilfred," said Cedric, pointing to his son. "My father, my father!" said Ivanhoe, prostrating himself at Cedric's feet, "grant me thy forgiveness." "Thou hast it, my son," said Cedric, raising him up. "The son of Hereward knows how to keep his word, even when it has been passed to a Norman. But let me see thee use the dress and costume of thy English ancestry—no short cloaks, no gay bonnets, no fantastic plumage in my decent household. He that would be the son of Cedric must show himself of English ancestry. Thou art about to speak," he added sternly, "and I guess the topic. The Lady Rowena must complete 2 years' mourning, as for a betrothed husband. All our Saxon ancestors would disown us, were we to treat of a new union for her ere the grave of him who she should have wedded, him, so much the most worthy of her hand by birth and ancestry, is yet closed. The ghost of Athelstane himself would burst his bloody cerements, and stand before us to forbid such dishonour to his memory." It seemed as if Cedric's words had raised a sceptre, for, scarce had he uttered them, ere the door flew open, and Athelstane, arrayed in the garments of the grave, stood before them, pale, haggard, and like something arisen from the dead. The effect of this apparition on the persons present was utterly appalling. Cedric started back as far as the wall of the apartment would permit, and, leaning against it as one unable to support himself, gazed on the figure of his friend with eyes that seemed fixed, and a mouth which he appeared incapable of shutting. Ivanhoe crossed himself, repeating prayers in Saxon, Latin, or Norman French, as they occurred to his memory, while Richard alternately said Benedicte, and swore Mort de ma vie. In the meantime a horrible noise was heard below stairs, some crying, "Secure the treacherous monks!" Others, "Down with them into the dungeon!" Others, "Pitch them from the highest battlements!" "In the name of God," said Cedric, addressing what seemed the spectre of his departed friend, "if thou art mortal, speak; if a departed spirit, say for what purpose thou dost revisit us, or if I can do aught that can set thy spirit at repose. Living or dead, noble Athelstane, speak to Cedric." "I will," said the spectre, very composedly, "when I have collected breath, and when you give me time. Alive, saidst thou? I am as much alive as he can be who has fed on bread and water for 3 days, which seem 3 ages. Yes, bread and water, Father Cedric. By heaven, and all saints in it, better food hath not passed my weasand for 3 lifelong days, and by God's providence it is that I am now here to tell it." "Why, noble Athelstane," said the Black Knight, "I myself saw you struck down by the fierce Templar towards the end of the storm at Torquilstone, and as I thought, and Wamba reported, your skull was cloven through the teeth." "You thought amiss, Sir Knight," said Athelstane, "and Wamba lied. My teeth are in good order, and that my supper shall presently find. No thanks to the Templar, though, whose sword turned in his hand, so that the blade struck me flatlings, being averted by the handle of the good mace with which I warded the blow. Had my steel cap been on, I had not valued it a rush, and had dealt him such a counterbuff as would have spoilt his retreat. But, as it was, down I went, stunned, indeed, but unwounded. Others, of both sides, were beaten down and slaughtered above me, so that I never recovered my senses until I found myself in a coffin, an open one by good luck, placed before the altar of the church of St. Edmund's. I sneezed repeatedly, groaned, awakened and would have arisen, when the sacristan and abbot, full of terror, came running at the noise, surprised doubtless, and no way pleased to find the man alive, whose heirs they had proposed themselves to be. I asked for wine; they gave me some, but it must have been highly medicated, for I slept yet more deeply than before, and awakened not for many hours. I found my arms swathed down, my feet tied so fast that mine ankles ache at the very remembrance. The place was utterly dark, the oubliette, as I suppose, of their accursed convent, and from the close, stifled, damp smell, I conceive it is also used for a place of sepulture. I had strange thoughts of what had befallen me, when the door of my dungeon creaked, and 2 villain monks entered. They would have persuaded me I was in purgatory, but I knew too well the pursy short-breathed voice of the Father Abbot. Saint Jeremy! How different from that tone with which he used to ask me for another slice of the haunch! The dog has feasted with me from Christmas to Twelfth Night." "Have patience, noble Athelstane," said the King. "Take breath; tell your story at leisure. Beshrew me, but such a tale is as worth well listening to as a romance." "Ay, but, by the rood of Bromeholm, there was no romance in the matter," said Athelstane. "A barley loaf and a pitcher of water, that they gave me, the niggardly traitors, whom my father and I myself had enriched, when their best resources were the flitches of bacon and measures of corn, out of which they wheedled poor serfs and bondsmen, in exchange for their prayers—the nest of foul ungrateful vipers—barley bread and ditch water to such a patron as I had been! I will smoke them out of their nest, though I be excommunicated." "But in the name of Our Lady, noble Athelstane," said Cedric, grasping the hand of his friend, "how didst thou escape this imminent danger? Did their hearts relent?" "Did their hearts relent!" echoed Athelstane. "Do rocks melt with the sun? I should have been there still, had not some stir in the convent, which I find was their procession hitherward to eat my funeral feast, when they well knew how and where I had been buried alive, summoned the swarm out of their hive. I heard them droning out their death psalms, little judging they were sung in respect for my soul by those who were thus famishing my body. They went, however, and I waited long for food. No wonder; the gouty Sacristan was even too busy with his own provender to mind mine. At length down he came, with an unstable step and a strong flavour of wine and spices about his person. Good cheer had opened his heart, for he left me a nook of pasty and a flask of wine instead of my former fare. I ate, drank, and was invigorated; when, to add to my good luck, the Sacristan, too totty to discharge his duty of turnkey fitly, locked the door beside the staple, so that it fell ajar. The light, the food, the wine, set my invention to work. The staple to which my chains were fixed was more rusted than I or the villain abbot had supposed. Even iron could not remain without consuming, in the damps of that infernal dungeon." "Take breath, noble Athelstane," said Richard, "and partake of some refreshment, ere you proceed with a tale so dreadful." "Partake!" quoth Athelstane; "I have been partaking 5 times to-day, and yet a morsel of that savoury ham were not altogether foreign to the matter. And I pray you, fair sir, to do me reason in a cup of wine." The guests, though still agape with astonishment, pledged their resuscitated landlord, who thus proceeded in his story. He had indeed now many more auditors than those to whom it was commenced, for Edith, having given certain necessary orders for arranging matters within the castle, had followed the dead alive up to the stranger's apartment, attended by as many of the guests, male and female, as could squeeze into the small room, while others, crowding the staircase, caught up an erroneous edition of the story, and transmitted it still more inaccurately to those beneath, who again sent it forth to the vulgar without, in a fashion totally irreconcilable to the real fact. Athelstane, however, went on as follows, with the history of his escape. "Finding myself freed from the staple, I dragged myself upstairs as well as a man loaded with shackles and emaciated with fasting might; and after much groping about, I was at length directed, by the sound of a jolly roundelay, to the apartment where the worthy Sacristan, an it so please ye, was holding a devil's mass with the huge beetle-browed, broad-shouldered brother of the grey frock and cowl, who looked much more like a thief than a clergyman. I bussed in upon them, and the fashion of my grave clothes, as well as the clanking of my chains, made me more resemble an inhabitant of the other world than of this. Both stood aghast; but when I knocked down the Sacristan with my fist, the other fellow, his pot companion, fetched a blow at me with a huge quarter-staff." "This must be our Friar Tuck, for a count's ransom," said Richard, looking at Ivanhoe. "He may be the devil, an he will," said Athelstane. "Fortunately he missed the aim, and on my approaching to grapple with him, took to his heels and ran for it. I failed not to set my own heels at liberty by means of the fetter key, which hung amongst others at the sexton's belt; and I had thoughts of beating out the knave's brains with a bunch of keys, but gratitude for the nook of pasty and the flask of wine which the rascal had imparted to my captivity, came over my heart; so, with a brace of hearty kicks, I left him on the floor, pouched some baked meat and a leathern bottle of wine, with which the 2 venerable brethren had been regaling, went to the stable, and found in a private stall mine own best palfrey, which, doubtless, had been set apart for the holy Father Abbot's particular use. Hither I came with all the speed the beast could compass, man and mother's son flying before me wherever I came, taking me for a spectre, the more especially as, to prevent my being recognized, I drew the corpse hood over my face. I had not gained admittance into my own castle, had I not been supposed to be the attendant of a juggler who was making the people in the castle yard very merry, considering they are assembled to celebrate their lord's funeral. I say the sewer thought I was dressed to bear a part in the tregetour's mummery, and so I got admission, and did but disclose myself to my mother, and eat a hasty morsel, ere I came in quest of you, my noble friend." "And you have found me," said Cedric, "ready to resume our brave projects of honour and liberty. I tell thee, never will dawn a morrow so auspicious as the next, for the deliverance of the noble Saxon race." "Talk not to me of delivering any one," said Athelstane; "it is well I am delivered myself. I am more intent on punishing that villain Abbot. He shall hang at the top of this castle of Koningsberg in his cope and stole; and if the stairs be too strait to admit his fat carcass, I will have him craned up from without." "But, my son," said Edith, "consider his sacred office." "Consider my 3 days' fast," replied Athelstane. "I will have their blood, every one of them. Front de Bœuf was burned alive for a less matter, for he kept a good table for his prisoners, only put too much garlic in his last dish of pottage. But these hypocritical ungrateful slaves, so often the self-invited flatterers at my board, who gave me neither pottage nor garlic, more or less, they die by the soul of Hengist." "But the Pope, my noble friend," said Cedric. "But the devil, my noble friend," answered Athelstane. "They die, and no more of them. Were they the best monks upon earth, the world would go on without them." "For shame, noble Athelstane," said Cedric. "Forget such wretches in the career of glory which lies open before thee. Tell this Norman prince, Richard of Anjou, that, lion-hearted as he is, he shall not hold undisputed the throne of Alfred, while a male descendant of the Holy Confessor lives to dispute it." "How!" said Athelstane, "is this the noble King Richard?" "It is Richard Plantagenet himself," said Cedric; "yet I need not remind thee, that, coming hither a guest of free will, he may neither be injured nor detained prisoner. Thou well knowest thy duty to him as his host." "Ay, by my faith," said Athelstane, "and my duty as a subject besides, for I here tender him my allegiance, heart and hand." "My son," said Edith, "think on thy royal rights." "Think on the freedom of England, degenerate prince!" said Cedric. "Mother and friend," said Athelstane, "a truce to your upbraidings. Bread and water and a dungeon are marvellous mortifiers of ambition, and I rise from the tomb a wiser man than I descended into it. One half of those vain follies were puffed into mine ear by that perfidious Abbot Wulfram, and you may now judge if he is a counsellor to be trusted. Since these plots were set in agitation, I have had nothing but hurried journeys, indigestions, blows and bruises, imprisonments and starvation. Besides that, they can only end in the murder of some thousands of quiet folk. I tell you, I will be king in my own domains, and nowhere else; and my first act of dominion shall be to hang the Abbot." "And my ward Rowena," said Cedric, "I trust you intend not to desert her?" "Father Cedric," said Athelstane, "be reasonable. The Lady Rowena cares not for me. She loves the little finger of my kinsman Wilfred's glove better than my whole person. There she stands to avouch it. Nay, blush not, kinswoman. There is no shame in loving a courtly knight better than a country franklin. And do not laugh neither, Rowena, for grave clothes and a thin visage are, God knows, no matter of merriment. Nay, an thou wilt needs laugh, I will find thee a better jest. Give me thy hand, or rather lend it me, for I but ask it in the way of friendship. Here, cousin Wilfred of Ivanhoe, in thy favour I renounce and abjure—Hey! by Saint Dunstan, our cousin Wilfred hath vanished! Yet, unless my eyes are still dazzled with the fasting I have undergone, I saw him stand here but even now." All now looked around and inquired for Ivanhoe, but he had vanished. It was at length discovered that a Jew had been to seek him; and that, after very brief conference, he had called for Gurth and his armour, and had left the castle. "Fair cousin," said Athelstane to Rowena, "could I think that this sudden disappearance of Ivanhoe was occasioned by other than the weightiest reason, I would myself resume." But he had no sooner let go of her hand, on first observing that Ivanhoe had disappeared, than Rowena, who had found her situation extremely embarrassing, had taken the first opportunity to escape from the apartment. "Certainly," quoth Athelstane, "women are the least to be trusted of all animals, monks and abbots excepted. I am an infidel, if I expected not thanks from her, and perhaps a kiss to boot. These cursed grave clothes have surely a spell on them, every one flies from me. To you I turn, noble King Richard, with the vows of allegiance, which, as a liege subject, but King Richard was gone also, and no one knew whither. At length it was learned that he had hastened to the court-yard, summoned to his presence the Jew who had spoken with Ivanhoe, and after a moment's speech with him, had called vehemently to horse, thrown himself upon a steed, compelled the Jew to mount another, and set off at a rate, which, according to Wamba, rendered the old Jew's neck not worth a penny's purchase. "By my halidome," said Athelstane, "it is certain that Zernebock hath possessed himself of my castle in my absence. I return in my grave clothes, a pledge restored from the very sepulchre, and every one I speak to vanishes as soon as they hear my voice. But it skills not talking of it. Come, my friends, such of you as are left, follow me to the banqueting hall, lest any more of us disappear. It is, I trust, as yet tolerably furnished, as becomes the obsequies of an ancient Saxon noble; and should we tarry any longer, who knows but the devil may fly off with the supper?" CHAPTER XLIII.